For half a century, a simple How-DEE was all it took for America to know who was on stage. With her straw hat and its $1.98 price tag, Minnie Pearl was more than just a comedian. She was the queen of the Grand Ole Opry, a cultural icon who brought laughter to generations. She was everyone's favorite country cousin, a warm and indispensable presence in the American consciousness every Saturday night. Yet there is a surprising paradox. How could a star of such stature fade from modern public memory? The answer lies in a secret that few people know. Minnie Pearl was just a character. Behind the straw hat was Sarah Cannon, a classically trained dramatic actress, a much more sophisticated and complex woman. Today we'll explore the story of two people in one life and find out why one of the biggest legends in the entertainment industry almost disappeared from our world. To understand the woman and the character she created, you have to travel back in time and understand the world that shaped her. Sarah Ophelia Colley was born in 1912, not in some mythical backwoods hollow of Grinder's Switch, but in the respectable, small, and tightly knit town of Centerville, Tennessee. In the early 20th century, Centerville was a town of church socials, Sunday dinners, and a deeply ingrained code of Southern propriety. It was a world with clearly defined social expectations, especially for the daughters of the town's most prominent families. And the Colleys were a very prominent family. Her father, Thomas Colley, was a successful lumberman, a respected businessman, and a pillar of the community. Sarah grew up in a comfortable two-story home, the youngest of 5 daughters. She and her sisters were raised to be proper Southern ladies. This was a well-defined role. It meant learning etiquette, mastering the piano, excelling in domestic arts, and aspiring to a good marriage that would further solidify one's social standing. Her world was one of civility and decorum. It was a world where a young woman's ambition was meant to be channeled into creating a graceful home and raising a respectable family, not into the rough and tumble, unpredictable world of show business. But from an early age, Sarah was different. She was a keen observer, a quiet listener, a girl with a sharp analytical mind and a deeply sensitive heart. She soaked in the stories and cadences of the people all around her, from the refined society ladies who attended her mother's parlor gatherings to the hard-working, plain-spoken men who worked at her father's sawmill. She was also deeply influenced by her mother, a cultured woman who, despite the conventions of the time, instilled in her daughters a love for reading, education, and the arts. Then came the Great Depression. The economic collapse didn't ruin the Colley family as it did so many others, but it cast a long and permanent shadow. It instilled in an entire generation a deep-seated fear of instability and a profound appreciation for the security of a steady paycheck. It was in this climate of national uncertainty that Sarah graduated from high school. While many of her peers were thinking of marriage or finding local secretarial work, Sarah harbored a secret, almost scandalous dream, one that flew in the face of everything a young lady from Centerville was supposed to want. She wanted to be a serious classical actress. She didn't want to make people laugh. She wanted to make them weep with the power of great drama. Remarkably for the time and place, her parents supported this unusual ambition. They sent her to Ward Belmont College in Nashville, one of the most prestigious finishing schools for young women in the South. But for Sarah, it wasn't about finishing, it was about starting. She threw herself into the college's highly regarded drama program. She studied Shakespeare, classical literature, Greek tragedy, and dance. She wasn't learning how to tell corny jokes about her kinfolk. She was learning iambic pentameter and dramatic theory. Her heroes weren't comedians. They were the great dramatic actresses of the stage, like Katharine Cornell and Helen Hayes. Her ultimate goal was not the Grand Ole Opry, it was Broadway. The character of Minnie Pearl, the unsophisticated, man-hungry country girl from Grinder's Switch, hadn't even been conceived. In fact, Minnie Pearl was the very embodiment of the rural stereotype the real Sarah Colley was so desperately trying to transcend through her education in art. After graduating from Ward Belmont in 1934 with a degree in speech and drama, Sarah Colley stepped out into the harsh reality of the Depression-era job market. Broadway was a distant, impossible dream. The only work she could find that allowed her to perform was a grueling position with the Wayne P. Sewell Production Company. This was no glamorous national touring company. It was a hard-working Atlanta-based enterprise that produced and directed plays for schools and community groups in small towns across the rural South. For the next 6 years, this was Sarah's life. It was a life of constant motion, an exhausting existence of one-night stands in dusty school auditoriums, drafty community halls, and makeshift church stages. She would travel from one small isolated town to the next, directing local amateurs, farmers, housewives, merchants, in light comedies and morality plays, trying to bring a touch of culture and drama to communities starved for entertainment. It was an isolating, lonely, and often dispiriting life. She lived out of a single suitcase, stayed in spare rooms in local boarding houses, and ate cheap meals in town diners. The pay was meager, just enough to get by. But these arduous years were her true education. They were her artistic crucible. On the road, she was re-immersed in the rural southern world she had grown up in, but now she was seeing it with an artist's discerning eye. She listened intently to the gossip at the post office, the tall tales told around the pot-bellied stove at the general store, the unique rhythms, phrases, and peculiar logic of deep Southern speech. She was, in essence, a cultural anthropologist, collecting the characters' stories and mannerisms that would one day become her life's work. It was during this period, on a trip to a small, remote town in North Alabama, that the lightning of inspiration struck. While staying in a local boarding house, she met an elderly mountain woman who had come down to see her son. The woman was simple, uneducated in a formal sense, but she possessed a radiant natural warmth and a wonderful, completely unself-conscious way of telling stories about her life, her family, and her community. She spoke with a delightful, homespun philosophy and a complete lack of pretense or guile. Sarah was utterly captivated. She spent hours just listening to the woman, absorbing her mannerisms, her distinctive accent, her infectious, good-hearted spirit. That night, alone in her room, something inside Sarah clicked. All her years of classical training, all her lofty dreams of becoming a great dramatic actress, suddenly seemed less important, less real, than the honest, authentic humanity of the woman she had just met. She began to experiment in front of the mirror, mimicking the woman's voice, her posture, her guileless expressions. She started to build a character around that core of authenticity. She imagined a backstory, a fictional hometown called Grinder's Switch, a real place, but just a railroad switch near her hometown of Centerville that she creatively appropriated. She imagined a life for this character, a life filled with a loving, eccentric family, Uncle Nabob, Aunt Ambrosia, and a perpetual, comical, and ultimately fruitless search for a fella. The character of Minnie Pearl was born that night, not in a writer's room in Nashville, but in a lonely boarding house in rural Alabama, a heartfelt tribute to a real woman whose name has been lost to history. For a while, Minnie was just a private amusement, a character Sarah would perform for friends to make them laugh. She had no idea that this simple country woman, this happy accident, would soon become her life, her fortune, and her destiny. Her big break came in 1938, completely by chance. She was asked to perform for a bankers' convention in her hometown of Centerville. Unsure what kind of sophisticated material to present to a group of stuffy businessmen, she decided on a whim to try out her new character. She went to a local thrift store and bought the essential elements of the costume: a cheap, slightly tacky print dress, a worn-out straw hat, and a pair of black cotton stockings. As a final accidental touch, she left the price tag hanging from the hat. She walked on stage not as the sophisticated, college-educated Sarah Colley, but as Minnie Pearl. She nervously launched into her routine, a monologue of gossip and stories from Grinder's Switch. At first, the audience of bankers was silent, utterly confused. Who was this strange woman, and what was she doing? But as she continued, her genuine warmth and the gentle, relatable humor of her stories began to win them over. A chuckle rippled through the room, then another, and soon the entire convention was roaring with laughter. They didn't just like her, they loved her. In that moment, Sarah Colley, the dramatic actress, began to fade, and Minnie Pearl, the country comedian, stepped into the spotlight. The performance was a local sensation. Word of this hilarious new character began to spread throughout Middle Tennessee. 2 years later, in 1940, friends who had seen her perform arranged an audition for her at the most important stage in all of country music, the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. She arrived at the formidable Ryman Auditorium, nervous but determined. The Opry at that time was a serious, almost reverent place, dominated by musical giants like its king, Roy Acuff, and the Texas troubadour, Ernest Tubb. Comedy was a part of the show, but it was a man's world, dominated by folksy male comics. She walked out on that hallowed stage, took a deep breath, and let out her now famous greeting, "How-DEE, I'm just so proud to be here," and launched into her routine. The reaction was electric. The audience, accustomed to a steady diet of songs about heartbreak and hard times, was captivated by this sudden burst of pure, unadulterated joy. The Opry management, led by its founder George D. Hay, immediately recognized they had something special. They offered her a permanent spot on the show. On November 30th, 1940, at the age of 28, Sarah Ophelia Colley, the aspiring Shakespearean actress, officially became Minnie Pearl, the pride of Grinder's Switch. It was a role she would play without fail almost every Saturday night for the next 50 years. The long, hard climb was over. She had found her mountain. For the next half-century, Minnie Pearl was not just a star of the Grand Ole Opry. She was its heart, its comic relief, its beloved aunt. She became a constant, reassuring presence in a rapidly changing world. As country music evolved from the raw sounds of honky-tonk to the polished Nashville sound, and then to the outlaw rebellion and the slick productions of the 80s, Minnie remained gloriously, wonderfully unchanging. She was a touchstone, a living link to a simpler, more innocent time that perhaps never truly existed, but that people desperately wanted to believe in. Her act was a masterpiece of character comedy. It was built on the simple, relatable foundation of the universal human desire for love and connection. Minnie's endless, comical pursuit of a fella was the engine of her humor, but it was never mean-spirited or desperate. Her jokes were gentle observational stories about her fictional family and neighbors in Grinder's Switch. She wasn't telling set-up punchline jokes in the traditional sense. She was inviting the audience into her world for a visit, to sit on the front porch and share some gossip. Her catchphrases, "I'm looking for a fella, love 'em," became part of the national lexicon. And then there was the hat, that simple straw hat, adorned with a spray of millinery flowers with its price tag, $1.98, still dangling from the brim. The story behind it was pure accident. For one of her first performances, she had bought the hat and simply forgot to take the tag off. The audience laughed and a legend was born. But over time, the price tag took on a deeper symbolic meaning. It was a symbol of her character's lack of sophistication, but also a powerful symbol of her accessibility. She was never putting on airs. She was, in a sense, always for sale, always available to her audience. What you saw was what you got. Off stage, however, the line between Sarah Colley and Minnie Pearl was stark, absolute, and fiercely guarded. When the show was over, the calico dress and the worn-out hat came off, and Sarah Cannon emerged. She lived in a beautiful, tastefully decorated home next to the governor's mansion in Nashville's most exclusive neighborhood. She was a gracious hostess, a savvy businesswoman who managed her own finances with meticulous care, and a devoted wife. She married her husband, Henry Cannon, in 1947. He was the crucial, stabilizing figure in her life and career, a former Army Air Corps fighter pilot who had flown in World War II. After the war, he started his own charter air service. He became her manager and her personal pilot, flying her to gigs across the country in their private plane. Theirs was a deep and loving partnership of true equals. Henry understood the immense pressures of her career and fiercely protected her from the intrusions of fame. He was the gatekeeper to the real Sarah, the quiet, unshakable center of her whirlwind life. While Minnie was perpetually, comically single, Sarah was happily and devotedly married for nearly 50 years. This profound duality was the central, defining fact of her existence. Many of her musical colleagues at the Opry, even those she worked with for decades, admitted they didn't know Sarah at all. They only knew Minnie. They saw the loud, gregarious, backslapping character on stage and assumed that was the real person. Only her closest friends, a tight inner circle that included people like Opry king Roy Acuff and guitar virtuoso Chet Atkins, were invited into her home and knew the quiet, intelligent, and sometimes melancholic woman behind the mask. As television became the dominant force in American culture, Minnie's fame exploded beyond the confines of country music. She became a true household name, thanks largely to her long-running role on the wildly popular and critically derided comedy show Hee Haw. For 20 years, from its debut in 1969, she was a fixture on the show, trading one-liners in the famous cornfield set and dishing out gossip from the Grinders Switch train depot. She also made frequent appearances on talk shows with Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas, on game shows like Hollywood Squares, and even on sitcoms. Minnie Pearl had become a certified grade A piece of Americana. But behind the relentless laughter and the public adoration, there was a private, enduring sorrow. For many years, Sarah and Henry tried to have children, but they were unable to. This unfulfilled desire to be a mother was a source of deep private pain for a woman whose public persona was so completely wrapped up in the ideas of family and community. It was a sadness she bore with immense grace and dignity, another vital aspect of her life that was completely hidden from the millions of fans who felt they knew her so well. The woman who made the entire world laugh carried her own quiet, unspoken heartaches. Perhaps the most profound, unexpected, and ultimately most important chapter of Sarah Cannon's life began in the mid-1980s, and it had absolutely nothing to do with comedy. After discovering a lump in her breast, she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. She underwent a double mastectomy and a grueling regimen of radiation therapy. For a woman who had spent her entire career projecting an image of robust, country-strong health and boundless optimism, the diagnosis was devastating. And for a woman who valued her privacy with an almost fierce intensity, the thought of making her illness public was terrifying. In the 1980s, cancer was still a word spoken in fearful whispers. A mastectomy was a deeply private, almost taboo subject, something to be hidden, especially for a female public figure. Initially, she told almost no one. She continued to perform at the Opry and on the road, wearing prosthetics under her costume, her wide, familiar smile hiding the physical pain and emotional fear she was experiencing. Only her husband Henry and a few of her closest friends knew the truth. But as she went through her treatment and began the long road to recovery, something inside her shifted. She had a profound realization. The very thing she was hiding, her terrifying experience with cancer, could be the most important story she ever had to tell. She recognized that her fame, the deep trust and affection the public felt for Minnie Pearl, gave her a unique and powerful platform. With incredible courage, Sarah Cannon made a decision that would redefine her legacy. She decided to go public with her story. She shed the persona of Minnie Pearl and spoke to the world as herself, Sarah Cannon. She gave interviews to national magazines, appeared on television talk shows, and spoke with a raw, unflinching honesty about her diagnosis, her surgery, her fears, and her recovery. She urged women across America to perform regular self-exams and to get mammograms, using her own experience as a powerful call to action. The impact was immediate and profound. By breaking her silence, she helped to shatter the stigma and fear surrounding breast cancer. Letters poured in from women all over the country, thanking her for her courage, sharing their own stories of survival, and telling her that her honesty had inspired them to see a doctor, a decision that in many cases saved their lives. She transformed almost overnight from a beloved comedian into a tireless and effective advocate for cancer research and early detection. This was the moment when the two halves of her life, the public Minnie and the private Sarah, finally merged in a powerful and unexpected way. The character of Minnie Pearl had given her the fame and the public trust, but it was the strength, intelligence, and compassion of Sarah Cannon that allowed her to use that fame for a cause infinitely greater than entertainment. She lent her name, her time, and her considerable fundraising abilities to the medical community in Nashville. This work led directly to the establishment of the Sarah Cannon Cancer Center. Today, it is a world-renowned network of cancer research and treatment facilities, a tangible, life-saving legacy that stands as a permanent testament to her courage. The woman who had spent a lifetime making people laugh was now, quite literally, saving lives. But fate, which had already given her so much, had something even more cruel. In June 1991, shortly after a performance at the Opry, Sarah Cannon suffered a massive stroke. It was a devastating event. The cruelest irony for someone whose greatest gift was communication. The stroke robbed her of her ability to speak clearly and left her partially paralyzed. Her 50-year career, her life on stage was over in an instant. Her cheerful How-DEE was silenced, replaced by a long silence. She spent the last 5 years of her life in a nursing home far from the limelight. To the public, she had all but disappeared. It was a tragic and quiet end to a life that had been filled with laughter and applause. Throughout those difficult years, her devoted husband, Henry, was a constant presence. He visited her every day, patiently feeding her and talking to her, even when she couldn't respond. It was a final profound act of love and devotion to the real woman behind Minnie Pearl. Finally, on March 4th, 1996, at the age of 83, Sarah Ophelia Colley Cannon passed away. Her passing marked the end of an era. An immediate outpouring of grief and nostalgia swept across America. The news of her death was reported by major news outlets, and solemn obituaries appeared in newspapers everywhere. At the Grand Ole Opry, The stage she had called home for half a century, there was a palpable void. Fellow performers, from the legends of her time to the younger stars she had inspired, shared tearful memories. They spoke not only of her comedic talent, but also of her kindness, her professionalism, and her role as the mother of the Opry family. For fans, the grief was deeply personal. Minnie Pearl's death was like the passing of a family member. On radio shows and in call-ins, audiences shared stories of how they grew up with her on Hee Haw, or how she brought laughter to their families during difficult times. People were not just mourning the loss of a great entertainer, they were mourning the passing of an era that she symbolized. Minnie Pearl's story is not a tragedy, but a testament to inner strength. She created a beloved comic character, but her true legacy is Sarah Cannon's courage in facing her illness and becoming a voice for millions. She showed that the true artist is even greater than the legendary figure she brought to the world.